network regional workshop on role of fiscal policies in a green COVID-19 recovery. Experiences, best practices, and next steps in the Asia Pacific region. My name is Hamza Ali Malik. I'm with the United Nations ESCAP, with the Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division. And I will be your moderator today for this first session of the workshop, which is on the role of green fiscal policies in the recovery. I'm sure all of you have received the background note. The upshot is very simple. A lot of spending has taken place in trying to recover from the impact of the COVID pandemic, but not enough has been done in terms of making sure it supports the climate action or supports the sustainable development goals. So we'll be talking in this session, we'll be talking about how can the fiscal policy be improved in terms of its role for sustainability in the recovery spending efforts. What are the best examples from the region that we can learn from? Some countries that actually have done that, so for others to follow. And in what way the green fiscal policies within these recovery packages can actually support the sustainable development goals. And more importantly, at the end of the day, we would like to try to tease out what are the main obstacles and challenges that policymakers are facing in trying to pursue in that direction, right? I mean, a lot of us understand the importance of these policies for not only just recovery, but recovery in a manner that is sustainable, inclusive, and low and promotes low carbon development. But why it is not happening to the extent we all like it to happen. So we like to try to conclude on those kind of insights. So we have a very distinguished panel here and some speakers. So let me jump straight to the first round, which will be, we have two speakers first. First will be Kaveh Zahidi. He's our Deputy Executive Secretary of UNESCAP, and then we'll be followed by Stephen Stone, Chief of Resource and Markets Branch, UNEP. So first, let's start with Kaveh. Over to you, Kaveh.
All right, thank you so much, Hamza, and dear colleagues, dear participants, dear friends. Let me just add my voice to Hamza's and to offer a very warm welcome to this regional workshop on the role of fiscal policies in a green COVID-19 recovery that's been organized by us at ESCAP, along with the Green Fiscal Policy Network partners, including the IMF, GIZ, and of course, UNEP. I'm especially delighted to be joining forces with my friend and colleague Stephen Stone from UNEP, and also very pleased to benefit from the insights of so many partners over the next two days, including in this first session from Brian O'Callaghan from Oxford University and Jeong Choi from the Ministry of Economy and Finance in the Republic of Korea. I think we all know that crisis like this brings challenges and it brings opportunities, and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic is no exception. Maybe no crisis in the past century has brought quite so many challenges to so many countries at exactly the same time. It would, of course, be perhaps an understatement to say that the pandemic has caused significant disruptions to the economies of our region, of Asia Pacific. Real GDP growth fell from around 6% in 2019 to -1.5% in 2020. And an estimated almost 90 million people have been pushed back into extreme poverty, and over 100 million have lost jobs. These numbers and these averages that I mentioned, that are probably well known to you, they really mask the true impact, because at the end of the day, the job losses have been concentrated amongst low-income workers, particularly women and youth and other people in vulnerable situations. The informal sector, which is so important to our region, was the hardest hit, putting the livelihoods of many of the 1.3 billion informal workers in the region at risk. And in a region with such high levels of inequality and where so few have access to social protection, really the long-term consequences on intergenerational poverty of this pandemic and its repercussions are hard to grasp. We know that Asia Pacific developing countries have, of course, responded to this, and responded in an unprecedented manner, deploying more than 2 trillion to support households and to support firms. But we also know that so far only a fraction of the recovery spending has actually had positive green characteristics. And therefore the region is probably missing the opportunity provided by the crisis to align the COVID-19 recovery efforts with national climate mitigation and adaptation aspirations, as well as with SDG commitments. As rescue spending slowly but surely evolves into recovery spending, countries will need to really radically change course to avoid locking themselves into further inequality, further vulnerability, and further environmental degradation. But the tools for this transformation are far from radical. They are essentially about reflecting externalities and prices and aligning government expenditures and subsidies with the broader environmental and sustainability goals. In fact, many green fiscal policies can be implemented pretty quickly because the collection mechanisms and the administrative structures that are needed are already in place. And they can deliver not only positive environmental and climate outcomes, but also social, fiscal, economic co-benefits, including a job-rich recovery, so vitally needed, along with employment, greater fiscal and resource efficiency, badly needed revenue, investment incentives, and innovation for low carbon development, to name a few. Now, of course, such policies are at the heart of carbon neutrality pledges from countries like the Republic of Korea that we're going to hear from, like China, like Japan. But the reality of our region is that countries continue to finance new coal, continue to invest in and subsidize fossil fuels, and continue to count on the brown recovery for their development. And our region is going to the climate COP26 in Glasgow with commitments, or NDCs, that contain levels of ambition that fall well below the Paris Agreement goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. And ironically, many of the same countries are also suffering the greatest impacts from climate-induced disasters. So the realignment that's needed, the realignment needed from green fiscal policies is no small task in breadth or in scale. Globally, estimates of the investment required to achieve this low carbon transition range anywhere from 1.6 to 3.8 trillion annually, while adaptation costs are estimated to be around 180 billion annually. In our region of Asia Pacific, ESCAP's survey estimated that approximately 242 billion of additional investments would be needed every year in renewable energy and a further 180 billion a year for energy efficiency. But on the positive side, these investments, of course, will reap large returns in the long run, as the uncounted cost of the brown economy, such as those related to climate change and health, far exceed the investments needed in green solutions. And I think this is exactly what our workshop is about. Our workshop is going to discuss how to finance these long-term investments with sessions on green bonds, green budgeting, fiscal policy enablers, green private investment, on pricing and subsidy reform, on carbon taxes, emission trading, all of these instruments that are so highly relevant to the Asia Pacific region and to the change of track that's needed. So dear colleagues, dear friends, I think COVID-19 pandemic for all of us is a stark reminder that what were traditionally considered as non-economic risks are already having severe economic consequences. And the past year has given us a glimpse of the expanding risk that lies ahead. In a way, the dual calamity of COVID-19 and climate-induced disasters have further exposed, certainly in our region, the inequalities and underlined the urgent need to invest in resilience, to invest in a green economy. And fiscal policies could be highly instrumental in these efforts, in our efforts to build forward better from the crisis and move towards a more inclusive and more sustainable future. And I really hope from this event that we can work together to turn our discussions on green fiscal policies over the next 2 days really into action in the countries of our region with the sense of urgency that they really do deserve. So with that, thank you so much for joining us, and Hamza, back to you.
Thank you very much, Kaveh, for sharing the big picture of the range of issues or options that are available for policymakers from the menu of options, green fiscal policy instruments that can be used, and highlighting that where we are headed, especially with the reference to COP26. A lot of action is expected at these major global meetings. And I think this workshop sets the stage pretty well in terms of specific ideas and messages that need to make at that level. So thank you very much for that. Let me now turn to our other speaker in the opening segment. I would now like to invite Stephen Stone from UNEP. Over to you, sir.
Thanks very much, Hamza. Kaveh, great to hear from you. Great for those opening remarks. Very grateful. It's wonderful to be working closely with ESCAP on this issue of green fiscal policy. ESCAP, of course, as an economic commission, is one of the anchors of economic policy in the region. We work with economic commissions around the world at UNEP. And I think this is a really important time when we start to realize that the environment is material. It is part of the economic fabric of our lives. And as you were saying, the risks of things that perhaps were seen as non-economic are clearly hitting the bottom line of countries. And so it's incredibly important that we think about what governs the economy underneath that's producing these kinds of outcomes. So really great to be working with ESCAP, really great to be working again with the Oxford Smith School. Brian, great to see you on the panel, and really looking forward to learning more about the case from South Korea, always a leader in the space of green fiscal policy. So just a few remarks from my side to kick it off as well. It's a big year for UNEP. We have produced our medium-term strategy last year, which talks about a triple planetary crisis. And this was even before COVID hit, right? We talk about the crisis of climate instability, the crisis of nature loss, the crisis of pollution and rising toxicity, which eats into human well-being and human health. These are all factors which eventually have an economic bottom line. And it's not by chance that they're happening. It's because of our economic model. It's because of the fiscal policies that shape the incentives for investors, producers, and consumers, and the way we govern our economies. It's about the institutions in our markets, which is where fiscal policy comes in, because fiscal policy is essentially how we hardwire our economies. And are we hardwiring them for long-term prosperity, or are we hardwiring them to be prone to more risks and shocks like the one that we saw with COVID-19? So colleagues, I think we have a really interesting opportunity in front of us today. You have around you some of the leading experts, certainly in Asia Pacific, but I would say also globally on the topic of green fiscal policy. This is a wonderful opportunity to dig down and, as you said, Kaveh, prepare our minds for what's coming, for the climate conferences, for the level of ambition which is needed, and the pathways to actually deliver on some of those ambitions. So colleagues, I won't take more time other than to say I'm really looking forward to these 2 days. I think we have our fingers on the pulse of what needs to be looked at. Hamza, I'm so pleased that the teams are working together. To me, this is a kickoff. This is a first for us with ESCAP. And I know our regional office colleagues, if they were here today with us, would join me in saying, let's build this partnership. Let's go deeper on what we can do on fiscal policy. And let's work with those leaders in your region who are willing to put these policies into place and see how we best support them. So from UNEP, a huge thanks to the organizers, and Kaveh, great to be with you again today. Hamza, back to you. So much looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. And indeed, ESCAP also really values our partnership going on for the last couple of years and with UNEP, especially in this particular area. We have learned tremendously. We managed to get the key messages out, as I was sharing earlier, before we began the session in our publication 2020 issue of Economic and Social Survey, and we certainly intend to build it further. So please expect us to remain engaged. As you said, this is the first of the workshops, and hopefully will be as we move forward and get into the more nitty-gritty and specifics of that. Indeed, it is certainly looking to be an exciting session. Let me now turn to the main researchers for the more hardcore presentations. First up is Mr. Brian O'Callaghan. Mr. Brian O'Callaghan is the lead researcher and project manager of the Oxford University's Economic Recovery Project, which he actually launched in May 2020. Brian is currently a PhD student at Oxford University and an Australian Rhodes Scholar. His core research concerns the economic impacts of fiscal spending. So this issue is very much in line with his core expertise. And particularly, he's interested in the role of green fiscal spending initiatives that can have an impact on economic, that can have an impact in the times of economic contraction. Some of you may know from his work that he co-authored back in 2020 on which is called Will COVID-19 Fiscal Recovery Packages Accelerate or Retard Progress on Climate Change? Dear participants, if you're not speaking, can you please kindly keep your microphones on mute so we can recover? So sorry, Brian, about that. So let me turn to you. He'll be talking about, are we really building back better? A global overview of the current state of play and some best practice examples of green fiscal policies in recovery packages. Over to you, Brian.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to both opening speakers for their very useful remarks. And I mean, it's hard to start a presentation following from the introduction as being hardcore. I hope that I don't bore you with our technical discussions. I thought it would be helpful to start with a bit of personal context. I've spent 1/4 of my life in Asia. I lived in Malaysia and Singapore and visited and worked in over 20 countries in the region, from Japan to Myanmar to Turkey. And clearly, I love the continent, and I no doubt will spend many more years there in the future. And one of the things that I love most about the region is its dynamism. Literally billions of people working to move above their station, focused to the future. And every time you revisit a major city, somehow everything has changed. I swear, every time I go back to KL, every second building has been torn down and replaced. And sometimes there's a highway where I thought a skyscraper used to be. And that kind of future orientation means that when good governments in Asia think about climate action, they see opportunity. Opportunity for jobs, for economic growth, for development, and long-term competitive advantage. Now, I'm not leaving out the Pacific. I also love the Pacific. I mean, Australia is home for me, and I've spent time working in several Pacific Island nations, including the Solomon Islands. And when I think about the intersection of climate and the Pacific, my heart gets stuck in my throat a little bit. I see the passion of strong Pacific leadership, and I'm sometimes just disgusted that so much of the rest of the world stands idly by. But today I want to bring together the ideas of climate change as an opportunity, as I've kind of described in Asia, and climate change as a threat, which is often how it is described in much of the Pacific. You see, I think we focus far too much on the peril of the latter without giving sufficient attention to the promise of the former. And I think there's also been an illegitimate split in some ways in which countries we classify as being threatened versus countries that we classify as having opportunity. We seldom talk, for example, about the climate threats faced by China. Instead, we talk about China's need to reduce emissions and their economic opportunities associated. Similarly, when we're talking about small island nations, we're almost 100% of the time talking about climate threats without talking about all of the good climate opportunities that are there and the good progress that is being made by those nation states. And so that's why I'm saying we should be bringing these two perspectives together. Now, with that context in mind, if you take anything away from my presentation today, it should be this. Green investment can bring stronger growth than traditional alternatives, while also protecting human health and the environment. And I know many of the people on the call today are experts in this space, but it's always worth repeating, and I will once again, green investment can bring stronger growth than traditional alternatives, while also protecting human health and the environment. And of course, today we're taking this a step further. We're discussing the fact that green investment as COVID recovery can bring even more growth. And that's because the impact of every dollar of government spending is highest in its periods of economic downturn, where demand is constrained and liquidity might be a bit lacking. Now, perhaps you're skeptical. I mean, or perhaps some of your leaders might be skeptical, those you report to. We've always been told that green spending is bad for the economy. Let me tell you right now, that is a complete lie. In May last year, and the presenters in opening kindly pointed to this, I worked with several global leaders, including Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, to survey 230 or so of the world's leading economists, including the heads of central banks and finance ministries, asking them what the economic and environmental characteristics of different COVID recovery policies might be. And we found that, surprise, surprise, green investment can bring stronger growth than traditional alternatives while also protecting human health and the environment. In the figure on the screen, this is the main output of the survey itself. You'll see on the x-axis the economic impact of different policies. Each bubble there represents a typical policy response. And then the y-axis is potential climate impact. In the top right corner, we call this our Greenielocks zone, the policies that are both seen in the survey at least to be good for the environment and for the economy. Once we took those survey results, we also reviewed what happened during the global financial crisis. And there was actually quite a significant amount of green spending following from that crisis, particularly from the US and also in China. And reviewing those studies and putting them studies of those policies and putting them alongside that survey data, we came out with a few overall findings. And I'm not going to go into detail on each of these. You're welcome to screenshot it or look into the paper in further detail. But the point was, in particular, relating to these 5 key clean policies, there are opportunities where you can get a bigger bang for your buck investing in green initiatives than in traditional initiatives. And the 5 we highlighted here these aren't going to be surprising. Clean physical infrastructure investment, which includes in particular energy infrastructure, building efficiency spending, education and training investment, particularly in relation to green retraining, natural capital investment, which can range from national parks to ecosystem and biodiversity services, and also clean research and development. Subsequent to that study, my team at Oxford has created over 10 additional country-specific models covering the jobs, growth, health, and climate impacts of nations, including quite a few in Asia, Indonesia, China, and India in particular. And we've advised over 20 nations on their economic response to COVID-19. In each case, the results are pretty clear. If you're targeting a sustainable and productive recovery, you need to A, maximize your support of green-specific initiatives. B, and this is very important, particularly in the ESCAP context, eliminate all support of dirty initiatives, which have likelihood of resulting in stranded assets, which ultimately impact negatively on population groups at home, lost jobs, etc. And then finally, there's also an opportunity to bring green incentives into neutral spending. Neutral spending being ideas like education investment or hospital spending. There are opportunities there as well to bring in green incentives. For example, green procurement standards in building a new hospital, or ensuring that your education facility, a new school maybe, uses 100% renewable energy with solar panels on the roof, for example. I'm also excited to speak now about one of the leading global projects in the public finance space in 2021. My team here at Oxford has partnered with all of the partners at the Green Fiscal Policy Network, as well as UNDP and PAGE, to develop the Global Recovery Observatory. The observatory itself tracks global spending in response to the crisis and assesses the potential environmental impacts of all of that spending ex ante. And that allows us to compare spending across the globe and country to country, but perhaps even more importantly, it's a tool to help governments learn from each other. In the Global Recovery Observatory, we have covered over 7,000 policies in almost 90 different countries. Those are the green policies, the neutral policies, and the dirty policies. That means if a policymaker, and maybe that's you, were to have interest in, I don't know, for example, recovery spending in electric vehicles, it could go onto the website, download the full data set for free, and sort by all electric vehicle policies that we've seen. It's really a powerful tool, and I encourage everyone to go to the website that's listed here, or to the UNDP Data Futures website or the GFPN website as well, to see the most up-to-date data and download the data set for themselves. What you see on the screen here is the assessment that was in one of our major reports back in March that was covering spending to March 2021. I've intentionally not shown the most up-to-date data, because if you want to see that, you're going to have to go to the website and see how different countries have advanced in the last few months. Anything else here? I think it's also important just to note that this is a graph on recovery spending. And in our context, it's very important to differentiate between rescue spending and recovery spending. We talk about rescue spending as that's designed to keep businesses and people alive. That might be unemployment payments or spending on a vaccine, versus recovery funding, and that is spending that is specifically designated to help reinvigorate the economy, right? Not just keeping businesses and people alive now, focusing on the future. And that's a really good way to equalize across countries as well. It's where governments have a lot more discretion. And now that this is my last slide, I think the opportunities in Asia are particularly strong, and this ties back into my opening remarks. And they're strong in almost all domains and across the region. They apply in the Pacific as well. So far, we've seen investment in the region already in clean energy, sustainable transport, electric vehicles, natural capital, efficiency retrofits, green market creation, amongst other areas. And that's just to say that there are opportunities everywhere you look. And if you have interest in what other people are doing, head to the website and you can see for yourself. I think that, just to close, the way forward for the region is going to be to focus on areas, and this doesn't have to be green, but to focus on areas where governments can simultaneously bring development and advance their social priorities, if possible, leading to long-term competitive advantage. When you're starting to talk about social priorities, though, it's almost impossible to disconnect that from our environmental priorities, because environmental threats very quickly become social threats. As you'll see on this particular slide, in the region so far, renewable energy has probably been the greatest recognized opportunity. And that's right. It's because of the wide-ranging economic impacts that come with high electrification. But renewable energy is really just the start. So what next? Well, you have a lot of fantastic workshops coming up over the course of the next days, and an really impressive set of speakers across many important topics. Beyond even that, if you're interested to hear more about the Oxford Economic Recovery Project, please do reach out using my email address there. We are happy to provide country-specific advice and targeting if that would be useful to you in your roles. Otherwise, thank you very much, and I'll look forward to questions shortly.
Well, thank you very much, Brian. For introducing the topic, clearly backing with the data, and the more all-important link to Global Recovery Observatory, inviting participants to actually explore for themselves. It looks pretty good to be true that you can have both growth and meet other objectives like human health and environment. So we'll come back to some specific questions on those lines. If it is so clear and the evidence is mounting, why it has not been done to our satisfactory level so far. But we'll come to that. Before, let me now turn to our second speaker for this part of the session. Let me invite now Ms. Ji-Yong Choi. She is the Director of Green Climate Policy Division, Ministry of Economy and Finance, Republic of Korea. She is currently responsible for international cooperation regarding Korea's green policy in terms of finance, as well as cooperation between the Green Climate Fund and the ministry. So last year, she published a booklet explaining Korea's Green New Deal. Actually, we also showcase in a box in our publication about Korea's Green New Deal, a comprehensive green recovery policy package. She has over 15 years of experience in the ministry and has expertise in international economic cooperation. She's also served as a commercial counselor in Korean embassy to Belgium and Luxembourg and mission to the European Union to coordinate the economic cooperation between Korea and the EU. So, Ms. Ji Yong, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Good morning, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to meet all of you today. And I want to thank the UNESCAP for inviting me to this event to share Korea's Green New Deal policy as one of the examples of green fiscal policies. And also thank you, Brian, for the informative presentation. It provides a lot of insight to Korea as well. Okay, for the past year and a half, the world economy has experienced the worst recession since the Great Depression due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In July last year, the Korean government announced the Korean New Deal not only to help overcome this crisis, but also to support the structural transition of the overall economy and society. This July, we announced the Korean New Deal 2.0, which reflects the current situation and our work in the past year. The Korean New Deal 2.0 has 4 parts. Digital New Deal to promote digital transition, Green New Deal to accelerate the low-carbon economy, Human New Deal to support an inclusive economic growth that focuses on the people, and lastly, New Deal for regional balance to expand application of the nationally based Korean New Deal to regions. Around 220 trillion won will be invested until 2025, directly and indirectly creating 2.5 million new jobs. Today, I will be presenting mainly the Green New Deal, which includes green policies that support the recovery from COVID-19. The focus areas of the Green New Deal are, first, setting the foundation towards net zero. Second, greening infrastructure. Third, promoting low carbon and decentralized energy. And fourth, building innovation in green industries. A total of 61 trillion won will be invested to this. Okay, I will now explain each of these objectives in more detail. First, to set the foundation, such as management system towards net zero. We are working to improve various management systems that support Korea's implementation of 2030 nationally determined contribution, including the measurement and evaluation of greenhouse gas emissions and emissions trading. We want to create zero pollution industrial complexes by establishing a resource recirculation system and promote a circular economy by supporting the development of new project model to this end. Second is the green transition of the urban, spatial, and living infrastructure. We will begin with the remodeling of 230,000 old public buildings, including rental housings, daycare centers, and healthcare centers to turn them into zero energy buildings. We will also accelerate the recovery of Korea's terrestrial ecosystem by creating 25 smart cities, smart and green cities, and large urban green spaces, while also utilizing AI in smart management of degraded water systems to secure clean and safe supply of water. The third focus area is to expand the supply and the use of low carbon and decentralized energy sources. We will build a smart grid to ensure higher efficiency in energy management and expand the supply of renewable energy such as solar, wind, hydrogen power to establish eco-friendly infrastructure. As a major component of our energy transition initiatives, the Korean government formulated the hydrogen economic roadmap in 2019 and has prepared 800 billion won, equivalent to 723 million US dollars in this year's budget to facilitate the transition to hydrogen economy. In addition, we will be expanding the green mobility sector with a target of around 1.1 million EVs and 0.2 million hydrogen vehicles until 2025. Fourth is the innovation in the green industry. We will be setting up 10 smart and green industrial complexes and 6 green integrated clusters in the 5 key areas, including for clean air and resource cycling. At the same time, we will also be laying the foundation for green innovation by encouraging a
capital.
Ms. Ji-Young, I think there is a connection issue. Lynn, can you hear us, Ji-Young?
Hear you. How about you?
Yeah, we lost you about the last 5 seconds, 10 seconds or so. So I think you can. Please go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead. Sorry for the technical problem.
That's okay.
All right.
Okay, I'll now move on to the fund. Okay, we also
Ji-Young,
maybe Ji-Young and Hamza, you can both turn off your camera if that helps.
okay, so now can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. There's a bit of noise, but we can
All
hear
right.
you.
If the connection is not so good, Ji-Young, I think you can try turning off your camera and see whether it helps.
Okay. So is the connection stable now?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, right. Okay, I'll keep going. In addition, we also set up a New Deal fund to support the implementation of the Korean New Deal, which includes the Green New Deal. This fund is one part of policy fund to support the New Deal project and relevant businesses. The government and policy financing institutions will first invest into the fund, which will be set up for 20 trillion won over a 5-year period. The second part of the New Deal fund is to encourage private finance flow into New Deal related areas based on strong tax benefits. Lastly, I would like to share the important thing. To ensure a successful implementation of the Korean New Deal, it's important to have the initiative of the president and the cooperation between the government and the legislature. This is why we have established a strategy meeting chaired by the president in the Committee on the Korean New Deal within the Democratic Party to ensure close cooperation. Okay, thank you for this opportunity to share the efforts of the Korean government to turn our economic recovery measures from COVID-19 into sustainable green recovery policies. I hope our experience will help other Asian countries set the necessary strategy for economic recovery. Thank you, and sorry for the disconnection problem.
Thank you, Ji-Young. Do stay with us. I'm sure the participants will be interested in probably knowing some more details of the 4 aspects of the Korean New Deal that you were highlighting. and the potential beneficial impact that it may have. So we have about 20 minutes or so for questions and answers from the floor. So you can share your question in the chat box, and then I can organize them around themes and ask to the speakers. If you can identify the speakers, that would be even great, or we can ask open-ended questions. In the meantime, while participants organize their thoughts, let me start off with one or two questions to Brian and Ji-Yong. Okay. So, Brian, if I may request you to come back for a minute. As Kaveh was also saying earlier, we are talking to the converted, it seems like. I mean, people here mostly are already convinced in many ways there are potential benefits from green policy, different areas of green fiscal policy aspects, right? And you made it very, very clear that it not only has strong growth benefits, but also it can help human health and environment, which I was saying seems too good to be true, right? But in our experiences, when we engage with policymakers, especially finance ministries from developing countries, they often come back and say, well, our first priority is to make sure we have high and sustained growth for several years. And sometimes when you manage to open them up, they are pretty frank and they're saying they don't really care it's green or brown or blue. They just want high growth rate because it gets them political mileage, it gets them job creation and other aspects. And the underlying argument tends to be that the concerns like paying attention to climate consideration or impact on the environment or greening the investment or spending packages actually are for developed countries. They can afford these kind of quality aspects. For us, it's much more important to somehow get the investments going, even if they are not consistent with the principles, so that growth is there. And later on, once we have sustained growth, we can deal with the environmental consequences and so on and so forth. That is, in a way, a nutshell of the, I would say, prevalent narrative around these numbers. So the struggle is, how do we convince those who are not already convinced? In our own research, which you also alluded to, an economic and social survey of Asia and the Pacific, the latest version in 2021, we did some formal macroeconomic modeling. Around build forward better policy packages. One aspect was around green development, and we were able to show quantitatively the same thing. It has better impact in terms of impact on the potential output down the line, and it has several other benefits as well in terms of environment indicators. So my question to you, Brian, is, in your experience, you've been engaging with policymakers across the globe. What is the main obstacle which is stopping them to really give a serious consideration to green fiscal policies? Any thoughts on the major obstacles, practically speaking, that they are facing?
That is a great and exceptionally well-framed question, Hamza. And I might refer to some of my experience on the not-for-profit side first of all here. I consult to the Robertson Foundation, who is a big giver in the climate and environment space. And something that we have learnt at the foundation is that at the end of the day, sometimes no matter how good your research is, no matter how beautiful a report you write, you're only going to create impact if you get the framing and the narrative right. And I think the same is true in the conversations that we have with policymakers and politicians, probably even more so. It's about the narrative and framing our ideas in a way that meets their political and other objectives. So in the case that we are prioritizing 100% economic growth and we don't care about anything else, well, fine, let's engage on that perspective. I think it's very, it might be tempting to think about the economy, the environment, and society as completely discrete and separate categorizations, but they're not. They're exceptionally interlinked. And what we've found and what we continue to discover more and more and more is that some of these social priorities do in fact lead back into our economic objectives. And additionally, have the other outcomes that are aside from the economic. So to be specific there, what has been demonstrated is that having a very high growth allocated to only the 1% in a population, that might boost your GDP per capita, but it doesn't necessarily boost the economic strength and adaptability, resilience of your economy. And so there very rightly is thought about, okay, how do we spread out some of those benefits and ensure that our economy isn't just dependent on a single sector, but covers a lot of different sectors. And you can have exactly the same types of conversations in climate. So I was referring to stranded asset risk. That's a very significant economic risk. If you are investing in a particular fossil electricity generation unit today, and it's not going to be economically productive in 5 years' time, you have a problem. The investment that you make today is not going to continue to deliver the economic returns that you're after. And so you really do need to consider some of the environmental changes that are undergoing and what that means for your economy. So I think to summarize, my advice would be engage on the issues, narratives that are important to the politicians you're speaking with, whoever they happen to be, and frame your messaging in line with those narratives. Meet them where they are. Once you have some type of engagement, you can work to shift the narratives in the longer term. But really the first step is engaging them where they are at.
Perfect. That, Brian, resonates quite well with the other strand of our work we're doing in the area of climate finance. And one of the messages we have here, which you pretty much echoed in a different setting, is try and make sure the policy, when you talk to businesses, for instance, try and nudge their investments, the private sector, in support of sustainable development goals in favor of climate action. How do you do that? They are at the end of the day interested in making profits. But if you can talk to them in a manner and offer opportunities that actually are profitable, and then as well as serve the climate goals. And that to me is the power of the public sector or the fiscal policy or the state itself to take lead and set these incentives mechanisms in the picture. I think you're resonating the same idea, same thing from the fiscal policy perspective, and then make sure you convince them policymakers that it has benefits on growth as well. If that is your priority, well, it offers that and more. So thanks for validating this kind of thing. This is good for one key fundamental messages. We have a few more questions. Actually, we have now questions from the floor, and there's one question from Marine Desteres. It has two parts to the question. One part, actually, I'll take first, and then I'll probably combine the second part with the second other questions. So the first part is asking about, this is to Jiyong, to you. They want to know about what is the role of legislation in Korea has been in terms of putting together this great new deal. This is a specific question. I can read the words for you if you cannot see that. Would be interested in learning more about the role of legislator in Korea, and more widely if other participants can jump in as well in putting together this green recovery package. So any specific insights from you, Jiyong, on this specific question?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. In Korea, as I already explained, we set a committee. We set a committee on Korean New Deal within the Democratic Party, which is the ruling party currently. So the policy is not made only by the government. It has kind of support from the ruling party. So it provides us, it enables us to get more government budget, to encourage more private participation. So I believe the legislature and the Democratic Party, they are playing huge role to provide us kind of a political will and to support the national budget so that we can invest a huge amount of money to the Korean New Deal areas. Okay, thank you.
Hamza, you are muted.
Okay, this is the famous tagline of 2020. You are muted. My apologies. So I'll come to the second part of Marine's question later. Let me ask you now another question from Himanshu Sharma. He's asking, what are the tipping points when it comes to greening public finance? The evidence, of course, on benefits is there and tools and implementation are ready, are well known. But what about the other side? I think that's what Himanshu is asking. So either Brian or Ji-Yong, anyone can have a shot at it.
I'm happy to jump in.
Sure.
Himanshu, I think that we don't know what all the tipping points in green public finance look like. And we are slowly, but actually perhaps now a little bit more quickly, starting to discover what they might be. One of the tipping points that we've been looking at into greater detail, which you're very well familiar with at the Global Recovery Observatory, is bringing greater attention to public finance. I've always been, and particularly in response to COVID, I've been kind of horrified at the absolute lack of transparency that there is in how governments use taxpayer money. If you live in any particular country, you might, once or twice a year hear about budget announcements, but the figures that you hear are interpreted from what the politician says and how the media interprets it. It's very seldom the actual underlying figures. You might hear we're spending X billion on Y initiative, but you don't really know how much that is in comparison to what they're spending on all the other things. Secondarily, you don't know how much that is in comparison to what other countries are doing. And so the Global Recovery Observatory is trying to bring a flashlight onto those patterns and the discrepancies that exist between countries. We're hoping that we can bring a little bit more pressure to countries in that way. There's nowhere to hide. Either you're going to be called out by kind of academic or multilateral audience, or you're going to be called out by your public who see this information and try to keep you accountable to it. So the democratization of fiscal spending information is one area that hopefully is a tipping point, and I'm sure that we'll continue to discover more and more as time goes on.
Thanks, Brian. Very important point. Transparency on where exactly is the money going and relative to other aspects. Excellent. Ji-Yong, you want to add from the Korean perspective? Is there any been debate in the Korea regarding the Korean Green Deal? Regarding tipping points and other aspects that came to the fore?
Okay, I may answer for this question by sharing our one-year experience of the Green New Deal. Over the past year, we have prepared the low-carbon and eco-friendly transition of the overall economy, including in infrastructure, energy, and industry, based on bold government investment and institutional reforms. So with the supplementary budget last year for 1.3 trillion won, we have invested a total of 8 trillion won to continue to support all the green transition areas. And also we have completed the legislation processes to expand the supply of renewable energy and establish smart and green industrial complexes. So those kind of government efforts provide a lot of signal to the private sector. So the Green New Deal initiative are starting to take places across the private sector and local governments based on larger scale investments and innovations of businesses and projects tailored to regions. Plans were also announced on private investment for wind power and hydrogen economy. And we are seeing more voluntary participation of business in green activities, such as through the Early 100 and KEV 100, which is campaign for business to transition to electric or hydrogen vehicle. All local governments across the country have announced their commitment to 2050 carbon neutrality. So I think the clear government policy and bold investment can catalyze the private movement and private financing to this area. Okay.
Thank you, Ji-Yong. There's another similar question which I was asking by Nadeem Ahmed. He's asking, there is no model to showcase the benefits of green investment to governments as it has long gestation period. So how do you convince the government? Nadeem, as I was sharing, I think there are evidence actually is building up. Brian and colleagues have built up quite a lot of evidence now that it showcases. This is the main point that he was highlighting in his presentation. I was also sharing ESCAP has done some work. The benefit, the potential benefit is there in terms of showcasing in a formal modeling exercise. So how to convince the government? This is what Brian's advice was. If I can use in the interest of time briefly, and Brian, you can jump in if I misquote you. Brian is simply advising governments to sort of talk to the policymakers what matters to them. If they really want to prioritize growth, we have to show them that this approach also has benefits for growth as well and others. And if they are prioritizing other areas, you can actually get into the nitty-gritty and details of how different aspects of green fiscal policy can affect. Brian, any other points you want to add to this similar question, or should we move on to the other questions?
Just one small comment, Hamza. When we do these models, you're very right. It is difficult to take into account some of the long-term opportunities that are unlocked. For example, what is the economic impact of higher green energy and how it relates to enabling your electric vehicles? Those are connections that we aren't able to well model, and so we exclude them. So when we're saying your green investment has higher economic returns than traditional investment, that's without even accounting for some of those indirect benefits that we don't know how to very well quantify.
Okay, cool. Thanks. We still have 5 minutes to go. I have a few more questions. This is from Asif, Islamabad. He's saying, although fiscal policy is important to define policy choices, in practice, its implementation will be largely depend on supporting the PFM tools. For instance, whether macro fiscal forecasts have taken into account climate change impact to address optimism in resource estimation or not. To facilitate fiscal policy implementation, what suggestions would you have for the governments to have a medium-term fiscal framework responsive to the green fiscal policy? So this is probably a little beyond this session. I think there's another session directly on budgeting, greening budgeting and those aspects also we might take up. But I'll leave it especially to Ji Yong if she wants to add something, because in Korea there's the actual package that is there, and I'm sure a lot of budgeting aspects or PFM aspects are covered. Ji Yong, you want to make any observation on this point? He's asking any suggestions for the government to have a medium-term fiscal framework which is responsive to the green fiscal policies.
Okay, I think that's very important and very difficult question to deal with for the government. However, we have to be in mind that while the previous infrastructure project only deal with the short-term recovery, I don't think that is sustainable anymore. That's why the Korean New Deal project focused on setting the foundation for sustainable growth while driving economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. So as I introduced in my presentation, we try to greening the infrastructure, the building and the energy infrastructure, which can not only deal with the short-term recovery, that not only produce the short-term growth, but also if we put more effort on greening the infrastructure sector, it can be also a long-term goal as well. So that if in summary, we need to work to transition to a low carbon economy and expand participation of local community to ensure just transition and reach a balance between economic growth and environmental sustainability. So we have to keep those in mind for our long-term, medium-term, and long-term growth. Okay, back to you.
Thanks, Young. Very clear. Brian, this one is addressed directly to you from Yasin Genjua. He's asking, are the countries with missed opportunities in your graph, such as Japan, UK, Australia, based on their performance at home or overall at the global level? And then he's linking it, saying on how to work with extractive partners that are not extractive industry partners that are not only implement green extractive practice at home, but in the developing countries as well.
Yes, very good question. And I need to remember to respond a little bit to the previous one also. But on this question, the limitation of our observatory is to fiscal investment and some taxation side efforts, not so much related to some of the larger private sector expenditure motions that you're more referring to. So if a government were to direct foreign aid specifically to a clean or a dirty initiative, that would be recorded. But if it's outside of that, unfortunately, we don't capture it. There is certainly a need to engage in that space regardless. But I think that maybe some of the other presentations over the next few days will be better suited to answering that question. And then just briefly, I know that we're out of time, but to the previous question on green budgeting, in partnership with the UNEP, we are developing our own green policy fiscal framework, with the idea being to simplify what is rightly pointed out in the question as a very complicated set of criteria in understanding what long-term environmental implications might look like. So we're trying to develop, based in some part on our observatory work, another very much simplified perspective that policymakers can do to get just a indicative high-level understanding of what different environmental impacts might be in the medium to long term as well. So stay tuned for that.
Okay. My colleague Lynn informs me that there is a break between this session and the next session. So we are having interesting conversation. There are more questions in the pipeline, so we'll continue. And those of you who want to remain engaged, please stay on. And as we are continuing taking the questions, Brian, is that okay with you? And Ji Yong, is that okay with you?
Yes, it's okay.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your flexibility. So here comes a little bit of interesting, I can say, semi-controversial question, just to push you, Brian, a little bit. Address you. This is by Zheng Jiang, who's actually my colleague in ESCAP. He's asking, to claim green investment is better for growth, we have to compare the opportunity cost. It may be true for countries which have the technological and industrial base to capture the green sector, but it is hard to comprehend this for normal developing countries. So, for example, to boost growth, why should Indonesia invest its valuable foreign exchange to import green energy technology and equipment to build solar farms, rather than hiring domestic firms to build coal power plants and use a safe foreign exchange to import ICT equipment to reduce local digital divide? See, so he's now comparing different options that are available, which can deliver, actually build forward better package as a whole.
It's a good question. I wouldn't say that it delivers build forward better as a whole.
So let's hear your views.
Digital perspectives are important, certainly, but I think that environmental priorities are pretty essential. I don't think you can say you're building back forward if you're somehow destroying the environment. That's not forward, that's backwards. In regards to the export issue, though, I think this is a very important part of the conversation for any government. You can't spend all of your money on green energy imports. That wouldn't make sense. But I think that there are creative ways to go about it as well, right? You're not going to replace 100% of your grid system and energy generators overnight. You perhaps will do that over the course of the next 20 years. So why not invest in your domestic production to value add at some point in that green supply chain? Indonesia is a very big country. It'd be significant if there were to be a leader in the supply, somewhere in that supply chain. It'd be pretty big domestic implications, but also potentially export implications there as well. So perhaps there are opportunities to take that little bit more creative, long-term oriented approach. Otherwise, I think that we would need to be very, very careful about any public spending that goes to dirty initiatives, right? It's one thing to enable a coal producer to build a plant. It's a whole nother thing to spend public money on that initiative. And I would advise governments to think carefully about whether public spending is really essential as a part of that process, or whether you can use your government spending to help push your private sector to do something a little bit more sustainable than what they otherwise would have done.
Okay. Brian, Zheng is pushing you a bit more. This is around the typical trade-offs questions that we normally get, green versus other kind of areas. So he's now asking, this growth-focused message that in a situation you get growth and other aspect, as you were highlighting, this growth-focused message may not be the best selling point of green development at all. Instead, we may want to admit that green development is a reconciliation of human and environment we depend on. And green development means sacrificing some growth for sustainability. That's the trade-off question, like to which extent you have to slow down the typical traditional growth to ensure sustainability. And then we also adding to that, we should also ask other question, which countries should make this sacrifice? The poor developing countries with little historical carbon footprint, or rich industrialized economies with very high historical emission and per capita emission today?
So I think the first part of this question comes back to the narrative conversation that we're having. Regardless of whether or not it's true that green development is required as reconciliation of human and environment, of course, I think that's true. But regardless of that, there are many contexts in which that type of rhetoric is going to have absolutely no impact on a policymaker. I do a lot of work in Australia, and Australia has a relatively conservative government now, many of whom don't believe in climate change whatsoever. Trying to engage them with that kind of idea, it's going to go absolutely nowhere. What I do in Australia is try to engage on regional jobs. That's where the political focus is for the current ruling party, and that's where we seem to have a little bit more impact. In the past in China, environmental measures have come a lot more easily when focused on air pollution than when focused on climate change. There's a very known focus for at both the high and junior levels of the CCP for reducing air pollution in cities, because there is a social imperative that leads to a political imperative in that, right? So it's I'm incorrect in saying we need to meet people where they are. It's just what I personally believe and what I've experienced. Meet people where they are and then try to shift the conversation from there. The second part of the question is important, and I perhaps should have highlighted this a little bit more in the presentation. To date, we have seen I think it is in the least developed countries, we now have seen about $20 spent per person in response to COVID, rescue and recovery. In the most advanced economies, it's more like 12,000. 12,000 per person versus 20 per person. That disparity is expanding gaps that existed pre-COVID and grew during COVID, right? It's just growing and growing and growing and growing. I think aside from the climate imperative for more rich countries' support of vulnerable nations, there's also this COVID response need for better concessional finance and other support. So I do think that it's really important to continue to pressure high-income countries to pull their weight in many of these conversations, but that can't be everything, right? It doesn't make sense for any economy to be investing in an industry of the past. That just doesn't make sense. Why would you spend public money on doing something that maybe worked 50 years ago? No, you want to be spending on what's going to work in 50 years' time. So I think that's kind of where the conversation gets to on that point. Okay,
good, Brian. You're trying to change the narrative, as I see. Good. There are two more questions, similar ones, so I'll combine them. One is second question by Himanshu, who asked another question, and there is, I don't have the name here, it says guest and main, but I'll ask the question. And I think Ji-Yong, I think you should respond to that from the Korean experience. It is asking, developing countries struggle with balancing fiscal priorities. So with limited fiscal space, there isn't enough public funds to divert towards green investments when there are more immediate and pressing needs that are to be addressed. For instance, as Brian was saying, for COVID-related expenses. So how do these countries reconcile these things? This is Himanshu was asking a similar question. Is this really an issue of constrained fiscal resources that you countries cannot even find resources to invest in the green areas? Is that your case? Again, from a Korean experience, since you have a specific deal going on, was there any debate or concern around limited fiscal space? Or if you, from the Korean perspective, you would like to share some insights on this point with developing countries that are actually facing fiscal constraints and are considering some sort of a version of Korean Blue Deal, how would they go about it?
Okay, thank you for the question. Actually, I would like to touch upon the importance of just transition, both in domestically and internationally. So Korean government also have Human New Deal as a big component of the Korean New Deal to help some workers who worked in the coal-fired power plants for supporting their transition in a stable way. I think this also applies to the relationship between the developed countries and developing countries. So, so I think the more advanced countries need to further support the developing countries for their just transition. And also regarding the balancing fiscal priorities, I would like to emphasize two important points here. The first, policy mix and the sequencing. Not all areas are effectively covered by, for example, carbon tax or one fiscal policy. So each government needs to find the best policy mix that fits for maximum efficiency and the maximum benefit. And also, as Brian previously rightly mentioned, we cannot jump to 100% renewable right away. So the government should provide clear direction and the aim that we are going to, so that the market can react rightly through the direction and set the priority. So yes, that is how I can respond to the sequencing, each country's circumstances. So there's not fit for all solution for the green fiscal policy. I think each government should find the best mix and the best sequencing.
Thank you, Young, for your advice. Brian, do you have any thoughts on this one? Do you really think lack of fiscal space is the constraint that green investments are not happening, or is this issue of priorities?
I think it's both. Certainly, in comparing the $20 spent per person to the $11,000 spent per person, you can see that the scale is very different. The nature of the spending on the $20 is even more important, though, right? If you only have a little bit to spend, you better make sure that every single dollar counts. You don't have the same flexibility to waste things to the side. But I do think that there is a real imperative to expand fiscal space in vulnerable nations. We're not necessarily talking about the Koreas of the world. We're talking about our LDCs and those groups in particular who just need the fundamentals, never mind the investment. And I think the investment is also really important, right? So a small tip here then would be, again, on the framing side, there are many governments who have advanced economy governments that have domestic priorities now built around climate change. I'm thinking about a lot of the EU, right? There are political needs to address climate change. And I think that governments that are of developing or vulnerable nations that are able to pull on some of those domestic priorities are going to have an even better go of it. So you might be talking to Germany and saying, we have climate investment opportunities that your foreign aid could be directed to, and we want to prioritize those initiatives. I think you're going to have a lot easier of a time than trying to get just broad, untied finance. So that's just another side tip there.
Yeah, I want to come back to the second part of the earlier question by Marine Destrez. I was waiting for the other questions. And let me ask one more question, actually, which I also had when I was listening to you, Brian. As I said, my understanding in ESCAP, the kind of messaging we are putting out in our research is, especially in the context of COVID, that sustained fiscal support is critical, both for economic recovery and to continue. So that, to me, the fundamental change in the narrative, when prior to that, even after the global financial crisis in 2008, that message didn't really stick. In 2008, everybody went in, government jumped in, massive fiscal support. And then 2010, the debate on fiscal austerity started. The concern on debt sustainability started to rise, and then there was a pullback. And Greece is a classic example of that, in fact, and they have a devastating consequences of that. To me now, actually, the debate is pretty settled, in my opinion, that fiscal policy is a fundamental instrument, and given the current circumstances, when you have COVID recovery in place, or needs for COVID recovery to recover from COVID, and significant investments are needed for climate action, for SDGs, and so forth. So the need for fiscal support is there. The question is, how do you, and we keep advising governments on increasing fiscal space, the issues that we were just discussing. But how do you recommend, how do we reconcile, especially in developing countries, the need for continuous fiscal space and genuine debt sustainability concerns? When we are asking, I'm sure we're going to talk in other sessions about green bonds or other instruments to use to take on more debt. One way or the other, given the limited tax revenues in many developing countries, more fiscal spending will end up having more impact on debt. How do we reconcile that? Do you think the entire conversation on debt sustainability needs to be revisited if we are to incorporate the green elements, or there's another angle to that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Hamza, and to the individual who asked in the chat. This is what I call the couch potato issue. I think that anyone who's tried to get fit knows that getting fit has a long lead time. But as soon as you stop training, everything disappears instantly, right? Imagine you start going to the gym, you start building up your strength, and then you just stop. Suddenly it feels like in 1 month it's all gone away. And I think that we can have similar issues in our fiscal investment. If we're making big moves now and can't back that up into the long term, we perhaps have a couch potato issue where we just turn back into a period of stagnation, and maybe nothing really changes in the long term. So in terms of that long-term debt sustainability framing, I do think that we need to try to push on the current narrative and prioritize where we can long-term partnership over single once-off grants or other initiatives. And that's certainly something that we include in every single one of our reports. Need to be focused on a long-term partnership.
Yeah, thanks. Let me now come to the question of Marine Destris that she asked earlier, second part of the question. So she's saying it would be very interesting to hear if any research has been done about whether different types of green investments had different impact depending on the type of economy. So is there any evidence on which particular instrument of green fiscal policy is used and it has a different impact, and it varies from country to country? Is there any research, Brian, you are familiar with?
Yes. It also depends, though, what we mean by instruments. If we're talking about a policy investment area versus how you actually implement the initiative within that policy area. But on both items, there is definitely discrepancy between countries, and we, as I mentioned before, have done some country-specific modeling. I think ESCAP has also done their own country-specific modeling. You're referring to it earlier, Hamza, and through those processes, you come to recognize that, hey, everyone is a little bit different, and hey, there are nuances in how policy can be applied in different contexts, and it's important to keep those in mind. One of the findings of our May report last year is that the devil is in the detail. There were some green retrofit policies, for example, during the global financial crisis that were very widely criticized because they didn't do their job. They were very short-term in nature, and had negative consequences that outlived the actual global financial crisis. Whereas there were some other green retrofit initiatives that were well designed, brought into existing programs, and roundly applauded in the decade that followed. So the devil can be in the detail, and I think that it's important to take the starting point, which is a conversation like this that says green investment is good. Here are some key areas to look into in further detail, and actually deep dive into those spaces.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Ji-Yong. I think we've taken too much of your time, 20 minutes over. Before we conclude, I will request you to 1 minute each. So before leaving, if you really have to leave a fundamental message from your side on the subject, between 30 seconds to 1 minute, what would that be? Let's hear from Brian first, and the last words from Ji-Yong Choi then. What is the key takeaway, Brian, you think you want to leave the audience with?
I think for me, I have to try to just true to myself and go back to what I said in the presentation. I said, if you take anything from the presentation, let it be this. Green investment can bring stronger growth than your traditional alternatives, while also protecting human health and the environment. That's the key message that is changing how we think about green investment in the context of fiscal spending, and that's what we need to keep in mind. I think a second point that relates to it is the narrative piece that we've discussed many times in the questions. It's important to meet governments, policymakers, politicians where they are, engage with what is important to them, and from that base, start to change the narrative over time.
Thank you, Brian. Ji-Yong Choi, last words, key fundamental takeaway from your perspective. What's your advice?
Okay, thank you so much. Key message from Korean experience. I think the government need to find the best policy mix. For example, because Korea, we have strength in digital area. That's why we put digital New Deal as our fiscal priority. And regarding the tool to make the future greener, we chose to emission tradings instead of carbon tax. So probably you can find your focus areas and the best options to use for the green recovery for the future. So I hope our experience in terms of Korean New Deal could provide some insights for the policymakers and the market participants. Thank you for today.
Thank you, Ji-Yong. Thank you so much again for staying longer than the usual allocated time. I think let's wrap it up. There are other sessions getting ready in half an hour or so. So let me thank our key speakers, Brian and Ji-Yong Choi, once again for joining us, setting the scene, engaging in a conversation. Thank you very much to the participants for asking penetrating questions. I hope I was able to do justice by covering all of them. I don't think I missed any, but if I do, if they're in the comments, we'll try and see if we can capture them in other sessions later on. And last but not least, I would like to thank you very much, Kaveh Zahidi from ESCAP and Stephen Stone from UNESCAP for opening the session, opening the workshop, and for their time. Thank you very much, colleagues. I hope you participate in other sessions as well, and I'll probably see you in other rooms. Take care and have a productive day. Bye-bye.